Was Erwin Rommel a traitor to Adolf Hitler, or a patriot who quietly tried to save his country from destruction? The question has haunted historians and the German public for decades because the truth refuses to be tidy. It is a story of battlefield genius turned political embarrassment, of trust and mistrust, of public myth and private alarm. Above all, it is a story about lines that blur between duty and conscience, between professional critique and political dissent, between obedience and what some called betrayal. Erwin Rommel was not born a symbol. He was born into the German Empire in 1891 and came of age in the mud and wire of the First World War. There he earned a soldier's reputation for courage, for tactical sense, and for a restless energy that kept him close to the front. By the time the Second World War erupted, the officer who had led stormtroop raids in 1914 had become a staff officer and, eventually, a commander whose name would be known on both sides of the Channel and across the Mediterranean. Rommel's ascent was as much theatrical as it was military. His audacity in the 1940 campaign through France, rapid, unexpected advances that seemed to outmaneuver the enemy, captured public imagination. He carried himself like a man accustomed to movement and improvisation. His tactics favored initiative over rigid doctrine. For a regime skillful at creating heroes, Rommel was manna. Joseph Goebbels and the propaganda machine elevated him as proof that the Wehrmacht was competent and powerful. Newsreels showed a smiling field marshal in the African sun. Newspapers praised his fame as the Desert Fox. The narrative sold the man as a natural soldier, apolitical and focused on the craft of war. That portrayal suited Rommel, and it suited the regime. But it was always a partial truth. Command in North Africa gave him freedoms ordinary German officers did not enjoy: authority to improvise, an audience for strategy, and a certain distance from the ideological maw at Berlin. It was also a brutal theater of war that exposed him to the practicalities of supply lines, modern logistics, and the limits of battlefield heroics. Yet while he could be wrapped in propaganda, Rommel never fully tuned out the political context. He met Hitler. He admired some elements of the leader's early charisma and national renewal. But admiration is not the same as wholesale identification. Over time, the distance between Rommel's professional view of warfare and Hitler's strategic whims widened. Manfred Rommel, his son, would later recall his father's mixture of pride and reticence. In family recollections, Manfred painted a man who loved the soldier's life, yet bristled at the spectacle around him. A father who returned from campaigns exhausted not only by fighting, but by the expectations the regime placed upon him. These family recollections are not a defense or a verdict. They are a humanizing window. They show a private Rommel who could be affectionate, stubborn, and painfully aware of the stakes beyond the battlefield. North Africa was where Rommel became Rommel. He arrived as commander of the Afrika Korps and turned tactical flexibility into a lethal advantage against the British. His daring raids and unorthodox maneuvers earned him victories and a cult of personality. But victory in the desert was always fragile. There were structural limits: fuel, supply convoys, the increasing strength of the Allied navies and air forces. The German and Italian supply situation was, from early on, a chronic problem. Yet Rommel managed to wring remarkable successes from what others called impossible odds. That was part of the problem. Success amplified expectations. Where logistics failed, Rommel improvised. Where his superiors promised reinforcements they never delivered, he adapted. The desert bred a commander who measured success in initiative rather than in resources. At the same time, the realities of the wider war began to intrude. The Wehrmacht's blow at the Soviet Union, the grinding attrition at Stalingrad, the widening front, and the never-ending need for men and material revealed that the German war effort was becoming overstretched. For Rommel, who had come to value clear operational logic, these strategic contradictions were not abstract. They were life and death for the men under his command. The loss of North Africa in May 1943, after months of hard fighting and with Rommel at times absent due to other duties, was a fissure. It was both a tactical defeat and a political moment. Hitler's decisions, his strategic insistences, and his rejection of counsel had tangible consequences. Rommel could see them on the map. The relationship between Rommel and Hitler had, until then, been complex but functional. Hitler admired Rommel's battlefield success. He liked generals who could produce results and then be made into symbols of German prowess. Rommel, for his part, accepted certain honors and the trappings of fame, but he disliked being used as a political prop. When orders from Berlin strained military logic, or when strategic priorities seemed to be driven more by ideological will than by operational reality, Rommel pushed back. Not always publicly, but in candid conversations with other officers and, eventually, in private letters and meetings. The turning point in Rommel's public image, and perhaps in his political trajectory, was not a single moment, but a confluence of blows. The catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Allied invasion of Sicily, the relentless bombing of German cities, and the growing realization that the Wehrmacht's capacity to defend the Reich was eroding. As the war's fortunes turned against Germany, Rommel's strategic realism grew sharper. He began to talk in terms few of his earlier admirers were willing to entertain: that the war might be lost, that further bloodletting risked the destruction of Germany itself, and that the leadership in Berlin needed a course correction. Part of Rommel's shift was military. He insisted that the key to defending Germany from an expected Allied invasion was to beat the attackers on the beaches. His work on the Atlantic Wall, the system of coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to the French coast, reflected his conviction that with proper defenses, the Allies could be stopped at the waterline. He studied beaches, landing zones, and logistics, and he advocated for tactical measures that could blunt or repulse an invasion. In late 1943 and early 1944, he traveled the Atlantic coast, inspected fortifications, and demanded materials for defenses. He argued for mobile reserves and for allowing armored units to be deployed flexibly. To him, success in the West depended on preparation and on freeing commanders to decide in the crisis, not waiting for centralized directives. But alongside the technical defense work was a growing moral unease. Rommel was not blind to rumors and reports of atrocities carried out in Eastern Europe, reports that by mid-war had become harder to ignore. He had not been a central figure in the machinery of mass murder, but the evidence that began to filter back about SS activities and civilian suffering gave him pause. It is important to stress that Rommel's response to those reports was not necessarily a sudden moral conversion into an anti-Nazi crusader. He was a soldier and a product of his time and milieu. Yet, the combination of military setbacks and awareness of the regime's brutalities fed a sense in him that Germany was on a path that would end in ruin, not glory. As the Allies prepared their largest amphibious assault in history, the internal dynamics of German command were critical. The Allies undertook an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, to convince the Germans that the main invasion would be at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Fortitude was brilliantly executed, using dummy equipment, double agents, and false radio traffic to create an entire imaginary army. German intelligence and many commanders were taken in. Fortitude bought the Allies a priceless window of time. Rommel was not immune to the fog of deception. He believed the Normandy coast could be the target of a major assault, and he feared that Hitler's stubbornness would leave German forces immobile at the moment of crisis. But his opinions about how to meet an invasion differed from Hitler's. Hitler wanted to retain tight control over armored reserves, favoring the centralized notion that he would decide when and where to commit them. Rommel wanted authority devolved down to field commanders who could react to the chaos of landings in real time. That is the practical core of the clash. Hitler's command style required political control. Rommel's military logic demanded decentralization and initiative. June 6, 1944, the day of the Allied landings, crystallized these tensions. Rommel had been injured a few days earlier, an event that would have profound consequences for his capacity to influence events. And he was actually away from his headquarters in France at the time the invasion began, reportedly in Germany for a family visit. The absence of one of the Wehrmacht's most competent and popular field marshals at the moment of landings had both practical and symbolic effects. Practically, it meant that the local commanders on the French coast had to operate without the forceful advocacy Rommel might have made, and that Hitler's centralized tendencies remained intact when the moment most required flexibility. Symbolically, it left Rommel vulnerable to accusations of dereliction that suited the narratives of both his supporters and his detractors. The immediate aftermath of D-Day showed the complexity of the German response. The deception succeeded. German high command hesitated in committing reserves, and when armored units moved, they often did so under constraints or delay. The Allies consolidated their lodgements and then began to expand inland. Rommel's absence became an element in the chain of explanations for why the German response faltered, and critics in Berlin would not hesitate to frame his absence as a failure of duty, even betrayal, though the situation was far from a simple moral calculus. In the days and weeks after D-Day, Rommel's private concerns became more public. He returned to the theater and saw the scale of the Allied effort. He believed with increasing urgency that Germany needed to explore an exit strategy that would prevent further devastation. What form such an exit should take was the subject of debate and moral minefields. Rommel, according to family testimony and several contemporaneous notes, rejected assassination as a political tool. He regarded murder, even of a man responsible for state crimes, as a moral line he could not cross. At the same time, he was reported to have been open, at least in conversations with some officers, to removing Hitler from power through legal or constitutional means, arrest, forced abdication, or a compelled resignation that would enable negotiations. To those in the inner circles of resistance who favored decisive action, the difference between legal removal and assassination seemed, in the heat of 1944, an argument over method with lethal stakes. On July 15, 1944, during a private appeal, Rommel took an even bolder step. He wrote a letter and made clear to Hitler that Germany's situation in the West was perilous. The letter, and the conversations that accompanied it, urged consideration of negotiation and warned against the policies that promised only ruin. Historians continue to study the exact wording and the context of that appeal. What matters here is the political meaning Rommel attached to it. For Hitler, even sober counsel about seeking an exit was tantamount to defeatism. For Rommel, it was an urgent plea to avoid annihilation. The two positions were incompatible inside a system where dissent was equated with disloyalty. Yet the story refuses to be cast purely in the terms of conspiracies and counterplots. Rommel's stance did not fit neatly into the categories adopted by the German resistance, which included those willing to plan and execute the July 20 assassination attempt on Hitler. Rommel opposed assassination as a method. He believed in saving Germany, he believed in a change of leadership if necessary, but he drew a hard line at murder. This distinction matters. It shaped how he engaged, or did not engage, with the coup organizers, and it shaped how evidence about his role was interpreted after the attempt failed. The July 20 plot, when it came, was a turning point of a different kind. A bomb at the Wolf's Lair failed to kill Hitler. The conspirators were rounded up, and the Nazi apparatus unleashed a brutal reckoning. Officers and civilians associated with the plot were executed or imprisoned. The regime stamped out the immediate opposition with ruthless efficiency. In that fury, the regime's attention turned toward anyone whose actions could be framed as sympathetic to the conspirators, or whose prior counsel could be cast as treasonous. In this climate, Rommel's earlier appeals and his reluctance to endorse assassination were reinterpreted. Hitler sensed betrayal where Rommel, arguably, saw emergency counsel. The dictator's answer to perceived treason was not subtle. Hitler wanted to neutralize threats, real or imagined, and he wanted to control the narrative thereafter. That necessity, in his mind, included eliminating or marginalizing high-profile figures who, by reputation or action, had stepped outside his line. Then, on July 17th, a seemingly ordinary event changed everything. Rommel was injured in a car accident. The details of the incident have been examined and debated. He was hit while traveling, and the injuries were severe enough to remove him from active command. For a man who had recently urged restraint and reasoned negotiation, the injury was a cruel twist of fate. It created a vacuum at a critical moment and offered Hitler and his security apparatus the lever they needed to define Rommel's end. The timing could not have been worse for Rommel's influence, and it could not have been more convenient for those in Berlin intent on silencing anyone who might be considered disloyal. Being sidelined by injury placed Rommel in a vulnerable position. Removed from the immediate military chain of command and less able to defend himself politically, he became subject to the regime's decisions. In the months that followed, as the state intensified its reprisals after July 20, Rommel's private actions and public reputation were reframed. He would be offered a grim choice: face the People's Court and likely public humiliation and execution, or take his own life quietly and allow the state to craft a sanitized narrative that preserved some honor for him and his family. The offer was couched in paternalistic language, a choice that concealed coercion. To many, this arrangement was a form of murder in slow motion. To others, it was the only way to spare a family and preserve a measure of dignity in a regime that had little mercy for regret. Even before that final coercion, Rommel's moral and strategic positions had created powerful enemies and complicated allies. Some in the military saw him as an inconvenient man whose fame could be redirected for propaganda purposes. Others saw in him the possibility of a leader who might rally a faction of officers toward a negotiated end. For Hitler, the calculation was simpler. A popular field marshal who openly questioned policy could not be allowed to remain an influential public figure. This is where the story divides into questions that are as much psychological as they are historical. Was Rommel's push for negotiation a kind of betrayal of Hitler, a turning against the leader of whom he had once been a favorite? From Hitler's parochial perspective, yes, counsel to seek peace was betrayal. From Rommel's vantage, insistence on prudence and preservation of Germany looked like fidelity to the nation rather than to one man. Which definition is the correct moral frame? Which lens captures the complexity of action under dictatorship? The pieces of evidence are fragmentary and interpretive. Official documents, private letters, family testimony, contemporary reports, and the post-war shaping of narratives all point in different directions. Some historians argue that Rommel's actions, particularly his refusal to lend his full moral authority to the plotters, demonstrate a man torn between principle and prudence. Others suggest that his counsel, especially the July 15 appeal, crossed a line in the regime's eyes that rendered him politically unusable. Still others emphasize his personal code of honor and his unwillingness to endorse assassination, arguing that he sought a third path, constitutional or legal removal, that, in the brutal logic of 1944 Germany, had no realistic chance. At the heart of this tangled thread is a human being, a decorated field marshal who had fought for his country in 2 wars, who had been made into propaganda, who had grown increasingly alarmed by the direction of the regime he served. He was not a clean hero who found religion and renounced everything, nor was he an unrepentant collaborator. He was a product of the Wehrmacht, steeped in military culture, but he was also a man capable of moral unease. The question of betrayal hangs on which loyalty one privileges: to a leader, to a political order, or to a country that Rommel believed was being led to ruin. If this investigation is striking a chord, subscribe and stay with this deep dive into one of World War II's most vexing figures. After D-Day, as Allied forces widened their lodgements and the fighting in France intensified, Rommel returned to a scene of logistical collapse and political paranoia. He saw the consequences of strategic errors in stark terms: fuel shortages, fractured lines of command, and the over-centralization of authority that impeded rapid response. The Wehrmacht's capacity to coordinate counterattacks had been compromised not only by Allied material superiority, but by structural problems that Hitler's command style exacerbated. Rommel's solution, in military terms, was straightforward: empower local commanders, keep armored reserves mobile and close at hand, and fortify likely landing sites. In political terms, his solution was explosive. If the German leadership would not change course, then Germany faced the risk of total destruction. Historians differ about what Rommel privately hoped would happen next. Some place him in proximity to conspirators who sought to remove Hitler by force. Others emphasize his explicit distaste for assassination. The record suggests complex contact between Rommel and members of the resistance. Some conspirators hoped to bring him into their plans precisely because of his stature and because they believed he would be able to unify other military leaders. For various reasons, including his moral objections to assassination and his hopes for a negotiated solution, Rommel never became a willing conspirator in the plot that culminated on July 20. Yet knowledge of his prior views made him suspect after the failed bomb attempt. There is a human drama in those days: senior officers scrambling to decide what to do, secret talks in hotel rooms and cottages in the countryside, the nervous calculation of whether an elite officer would risk everything to act. For Rommel, who had seen the human cost of prolonged campaigns, the calculus was not purely political. He had a family. He had a reputation. He had a sense of honor that made complicity in murder unthinkable. These are not excuses, they are factors that shaped real-time decisions in a volatile moment. The July 17 car accident that incapacitated Rommel was a pivot. Physically removed, he could not publicly steer events. That moment suspended his agency and left his fate to the agents of a regime that had already decided who was friend and who was foe. What followed, the offer of suicide in exchange for a state funeral and avoidance of a public trial, was a grotesque attempt to manage a problem without exposing the regime to embarrassment. To historians, it reads like an effort to preserve a myth. Keep Rommel's reputation intact enough to placate the army and the public, while eliminating a man who could be a focal point for dissent. But even in those final months of active life and then enforced silence, the image of Rommel continued to mean different things to different people. For some Germans, he remained a hero, the honorable general who had tried to defend the fatherland to the last. For others, he was a figure whose proximity to Nazism and whose initial consent to the regime's military aims made him complicit. For the Nazis who survived the purge after July 20, he was either a victim of plotters or a traitor, depending on the convenience of the narrative. Historiography has tried to sort these meanings out. Post-war memoirs, family recollections, official records, and archives have allowed successive generations of scholars to reassess the evidence. Some emphasize Rommel's tactical brilliance and his limitations as a moral actor. Others note that his operational critiques of Hitler were clear and persistent long before the final year of the war. The debate is not merely academic. It shapes how memory of the Wehrmacht is framed in Germany and how responsibility is allocated in a nation wrestling with the legacy of Nazism. And yet, the most difficult questions resist tidy resolution. Did Rommel's counsel amount to betrayal? That depends on the definition. If betrayal is obedience to Hitler above all else, then Rommel's doubts were certainly a betrayal of that personal loyalty. If betrayal is an active conspiracy to undermine the state with treasonous intent, the evidence is less clear. He did not endorse assassination. He did exhort changes that the Führer interpreted as defeatism. In a totalitarian system, even a request for negotiation can look, to the ruler with absolute power, like an existential threat. The story reaches toward tragedy in the way public narrative and private intent collided. A man who had been a public emblem became, in the eyes of the regime he had served, a danger. The state offered him an escape that saved his family from public disgrace, but ended his life. The official funeral and the sanitized accounts that followed attempted to bury not only a man, but also a set of uncomfortable conversations about complicity, dissent, and the limits of military obedience. By mid-1944, the lines between military dissent and political treason had been blurred by events and by the will of those in power. Rommel's path, from the sun-drenched deserts to the gray coastlines of Western Europe, from public adulation to forced silence, illustrates how one man's attempts to serve his country could be read as betrayal by those who saw any deviation from absolute loyalty as intolerable. As the calendar turned toward autumn and Germany's internal purges intensified, Rommel lay wounded, his fate increasingly in the hands of men who would decide not only his death, but the story that would be told about him. That story would matter, because narratives shape memory, and memory shapes the moral calculus of generations. The question that began this investigation, was Rommel a betrayer of Hitler or of Germany, therefore demands an answer that can hold complexity. One that recognizes the difference between counsel and conspiracy, between a plea for negotiated peace and a plot to murder. Yet the historical record does not yield a single comfortable verdict. It offers instead a sequence of actions and motives tangled with coercion, timing, and chance. The choices made in the summer of 1944 were shaped by the fog of war and by the climate of fear a totalitarian regime cultivated. Rommel's voice, sometimes blunt, sometimes pleading, sometimes withdrawn, is audible in fragments, in letters, in conversations reported by colleagues, in the recollections of his son and wife. Those fragments form an incomplete mosaic. They can suggest a man who tried to steer Germany away from catastrophe without ever embracing the murder that some conspirators were willing to authorize. They can also suggest a man who, by remaining within the Wehrmacht's structures and accepting honors from a criminal regime, never fully extricated himself from complicity. Which is closer to the truth? The answer matters because it reframes the moral map of the German officer corps in 1944. If Rommel was primarily a soldier whose conscience eventually clashed with policy, then his story is one of tragic limitation. If he was a noble dissenter who nearly joined the resistance, then his refusal to endorse assassination looks like prudence or cowardice, depending on the moral language chosen. If he was an opportunist who attempted to preserve his reputation, then the narrative shifts again. This web of possibilities points to something more fundamental. In authoritarian systems, the meaning of dissent is often determined after the fact by those who win and by those who write the history. For Hitler and his inner circle, any attempt to change course was a mortal threat. For Rommel and those around him, the attempt could be framed as an effort to save a nation. The difference is not merely semantic. It is the difference between life and death, between public execution and a state-sponsored lie that would allow a family to grieve and a nation to remember a sanitized version of its past. As summer 1944 gave way to a harsher autumn, Rommel's capacity to influence events dwindled. In the weeks after the July car accident, decisions about his fate became primarily political. The regime, seeking to neutralize an inconvenient figure, offered terms that read like a grotesque bargain. For the military class and the family who loved him, there was no good option. For the regime, the tidy solution preserved a degree of stability. A celebrated field marshal's funeral would mollify public opinion, while his removal from the political scene would remove a potential rallying point for dissent. This is the moment where personal tragedy and political necessity collide. The man who had once ridden through the deserts to the adulation of his country was, in effect, being asked to pay the ultimate price for counsel that the leader could not tolerate. The formal apparatus of statecraft, investigations, decrees, and the manipulation of public narrative would obscure much of what happened in the hours and days after Rommel's incapacitation. That opaqueness has made it difficult for historians to write a definitive moral judgment. It has also preserved the question at the center of our inquiry. We must therefore return to the title, Rommel's Betrayal of Hitler: What Really Happened? The answer is not a single sentence. It is a sequence of choices, misjudgments, and coercions that culminated in a forced removal. Rommel did not join in the assassination plot. He rejected that method. He did, however, make clear his belief that Germany needed a path away from ruin, and was willing, in private and in his council, to entertain removal of Hitler by nonviolent means. For Hitler, that stance equaled betrayal. For Rommel, it was an attempt to preserve Germany, even if the means he favored were politically naive or morally ambiguous to others. The summer's events did not simply produce a binary verdict of loyalty or treason. They produced a more troubling portrait of a soldier who had become entangled in politics and who, when he spoke truth as he saw it, found himself isolated and, in the end, silenced. The forces that silenced him, the mechanisms of a murderous regime, the paranoia born of a failed coup, and the accidents of timing and injury, made his fate a public spectacle and a private sorrow. There are still pieces of the puzzle left to examine. The precise content of Rommel's July 15 appeal, the scope of his contacts with conspirators, the state's internal deliberations about how to neutralize him without causing a mutiny, and the post-war efforts to shape his memory. Those elements will determine whether we ultimately say Rommel betrayed Hitler in a political sense, whether we call his actions treason, or whether we accept a more ambivalent verdict, that he was a man whose loyalty to his country eventually overcame his personal loyalty to a single leader, and that in a totalitarian system, such a shift looks like betrayal to the ruler and like patriotism to the man. The next chapter of this story moves into the immediate aftermath of the failed July 20 plot, the machinery of reprisal that swept through the military, and the final acts that led to Rommel's death. It is there, in the crossing of official coercion and private resolution, that the most decisive choices were made, not only for Rommel, but for the narrative that would survive him. The weeks after July 20th did not simply close a chapter, they opened a purge. The failed bomb at the Wolf's Lair had detonated more than explosive, it detonated fear. The Nazi security apparatus moved with ruthless swiftness and with the kind of judicial pantomime the regime specialized in. Show trials, confessions obtained under torture, hangings and shootings intended to terrify any officer or civil servant who might entertain disloyal thought. The net was wide, and suspicion extended to anybody whose record suggested contact with the conspirators or even sympathy for their aims. Rommel's name floated uneasily in those waters. He had not been present at the inner councils that planned the assassination. He had not signed conspirators' manifestos. He had refused to countenance murder. Yet Rommel's earlier appeals for negotiation, his conversations with officers who were implicated, and his general stance against continuing the war at all costs made him suspect in a regime that equated deviation with treason. In the logic of the Führer, any council that weakened the will to fight amounted to a political virus that had to be exiled. For several weeks after July, Rommel remained removed from direct command because of the injuries he had suffered on July 17th. The accident, whether ordinary misfortune or an irony of timing, had incapacitated him at the moment his voice might have mattered most. In the eyes of the security services in Berlin, the accident was convenient. A high-profile general who had raised uncomfortable questions was suddenly less able to articulate or organize dissent. That left decisions about him largely in the hands of men who believed that the problem must be solved, not debated. What followed in autumn of 1944 illustrates the brutal calculus of the regime. In mid-October, officers arrived at Rommel's home and conveyed an ultimatum. The details of those conversations have been reconstructed from post-war testimony and archival documents. Historians have pieced together a chilling negotiation. The terms were framed as a mercy. Rommel would be given a state funeral, his family would be spared the degradation and reprisals typical of a convicted traitor, and the narrative of a dignified death would be preserved, provided he took his own life, quietly, in exchange for silence about the details. The alternative, presented in stark terms, was a public show trial by the People's Court and certain execution, followed by the confiscation of property and reprisals against kin. To modern eyes, the choice on offer was a grotesque fiction. It was not a voluntary act, but the final move in a coercive script that the regime had perfected. Offer a veneer of honor in exchange for eliminating a politically inconvenient figure and control of the story afterward. For Rommel, the decision was not only about his life, but about protecting his wife, Lucy, and their son, Manfred, and about sparing the family the public spectacle the regime delighted in staging against its enemies. On October 14, 1944, Rommel chose silence over spectacle. According to surviving accounts, he swallowed poison and died that day. The state quickly produced a sanitized explanation: complications from wounds sustained in the July accident. 2 days later, October 16, he was afforded a state funeral, a public theater of honor arranged by a regime that had just arranged his death. The optics were deliberate. In offering a ceremonious burial, the regime neutralized a potential martyr and reshaped public memory to serve stability. The funeral spared Rommel's family the immediate cruelty of public shaming, but it also fixed in place a version of events calculated to distance him from the ever-widening catalog of regime crimes. The immediacy of the forced end did not end the debate, it sharpened it. In the years and decades that followed, Rommel's death became the core around which narratives were spun, contested, and rewritten. For the Nazi state in its dying months, the fiction served a purpose. The Wehrmacht needed its reputations to be preserved to maintain morale, and removing Rommel quietly allowed Hitler to pretend continuity and control. For post-war Germany and for the Allied occupation authorities, the story of Rommel offered a useful, if problematic, figure. A brilliant general who, apparently, had refused to partake in the worst of the regime's crimes, and who had, in his late months, argued for realism and restraint. That post-war rehabilitation of Rommel's image, the clean Wehrmacht myth, in which professional soldiers were disentangled from Nazi crimes, would prove historically durable and politically convenient. It allowed many in West Germany to reclaim a military tradition without confronting the full complicity of the officer corps. It also served Allied rhetorical needs during the early Cold War, when the Western powers sought a quick, stabilizing recalibration of German public life. Rommel's sanitized legend, then, was part memory and part political instrument. But myth-making always leaves gaps, and subsequent historians set about filling them with documentation and sober analysis. Post-war interrogations, private letters, diary entries, and archival work exposed the ambiguities that a state funeral had tried to erase. Manfred Rommel's recollections, offered decades later, complicated that sanitized image by humanizing rather than sanitizing his father's contradictions. He recalled a man proud of military craft yet repelled by spectacle, a father who worried about civilian suffering, and a husband who tried, painfully and imperfectly, to navigate the demands of conscience and duty. Those family testimonies are invaluable precisely because they are partial, and partiality is human. They do not absolve errors, nor do they invent arguments Rommel did not make. Contemporary historians have therefore approached Rommel as a paradox: tactically brilliant, politically naive, morally ambiguous. The key strands of evidence that inform that judgment are threefold. First are Rommel's overt military positions, his insistence on preparing the Atlantic Wall, his practical recommendations for mobile defense, and his operational priorities aimed at stopping an amphibious invasion. Those positions were professionally motivated and reflected sound military logic. They were not in themselves politically subversive. Second are Rommel's political interventions, his private letters, conversations with colleagues, and the July 15 petition in which he urged consideration of negotiation or leadership change. Those interventions placed him at odds with Hitler's zero-sum conception of loyalty. Third are Rommel's moral reactions, the degree to which he had learned about and been troubled by the regime's brutalities. While Rommel did not publicize opposition to the regime's crimes, evidence suggests that knowledge of atrocities contributed to his disillusionment and to his sense that Germany's path was self-destructive. The heart of the debate thus returns to intention and effect. Did Rommel betray Hitler? If by betrayal one means the active, conspiratorial effort to take a life or overthrow a regime through illegal violence, the answer is plainly no. Rommel rejected assassination and never took part in the bomb plot. If by betrayal one means a person who, once loyal to a commander, shifts to counseled opposition, seeking to remove a leader through legal or political means to save the nation, then the case is more complicated. Rommel's counsel for negotiation and his acceptance of arrest or removal as legitimate instruments rather than murder marked him as someone willing to place the country's survival above personal fidelity to one man. In the logic of Hitler's inner circle, that was betrayal. To Rommel and many of his contemporaries, it was arguably patriotism. We can examine a few concrete episodes to see how this plays out in practice. Take, for instance, the Atlantic Wall. Rommel poured energy into fortifications because he believed the invasion must be stopped at the water's edge. He argued for mobile reserves and for a decentralized command structure at the moment of crisis. Those ideas were military prescriptions. They were not designed to subvert the state. Yet the political consequence of such disagreement with Hitler, insistence on central control, was a widening gulf between military logic and political will. Rommel's repeated objections began to take on political coloration precisely because Hitler's authority was absolute and dissent could not be absorbed. Then consider the July 15 appeal. The letter and conversations were not a declaration of intent to seize power. They were a plea for realism, a hope that cooler heads might prevent the destruction of Germany. Yet, in a regime that equated questioning with betrayal, such pleas were treated as treasonous. The distinction between political treason and political counsel was thus erased by the dynamics of totalitarian governance. Rommel's failure to navigate how his counsel would be interpreted does not mark him either as a traitor or as an innocent. Instead, it illuminates the peril of counsel where the ruler will not tolerate counsel at all. Finally, there is Rommel's response to the conspirators. His refusal to endorse assassination was both moral and strategic. Rommel saw assassination as an ignoble instrument and believed that legality and legitimacy mattered for stabilizing the post-Hitler period. That position reveals a man deeply committed to a code that valued certain procedural and moral forms even in extremis. To the conspirators, impatient and convinced of necessity, Rommel's line was frustrating and insufficient. To Hitler, it was an insufficient defense. To some modern critics, it appears as moral hedging at a moment when decisive action might have saved lives. Each interpretation has its own assumptions and moral yardsticks. The broader context, though, is crucial. Living under a totalitarian system, the options available to any prominent figure were severely constricted. Public opposition invited immediate destruction. Private counsel could be misread or used as pretext. Rommel's celebrity complicated matters further. He was visible, a man whose reputation could inspire others. In such circumstances, the regime's need to eliminate ambiguous loyalties, not only because of what they were, but because of what they could become, explains the ferocity of its response. More than 70 years of scholarship have attempted to untangle Rommel's knot, but the result is less a resolution than a consensus about ambiguity. Scholars generally agree that Rommel was not a committed Nazi ideologue. They also agree he was not an outright resistor prepared to pay the highest price for wholesale regime overthrow. Between those poles lie many shades. A soldier with conservative ideals who accepted the state's military aims for a long time, who gradually became convinced that Hitler's strategic choices endangered Germany, and who proposed remedies that would not include assassination. Those remedies were, in the context of the time, politically impotent. In a system where Hitler equated counsel with treason, Rommel's moderate approach was doomed to fail. Historians still debate the degree of Rommel's direct contact with the July conspirators and how much those contacts should alter our reading of his motives. Evidence suggests he had acquaintances within the resistance and that some officers sought to enlist him because of his stature. But the decisive fact remains: Rommel did not endorse assassination. He wanted leadership change by arrest or legal means, not by explosive violence. That refusal is ethically significant. It marks a moral boundary Rommel was unwilling to cross. Whether that boundary makes him morally praiseworthy or strategically culpable depends on whether one values moral means over moral ends, and whether one thinks in July 1944 there was any realistic nonviolent path to effecting Hitler's removal. Rommel's posthumous image has also been shaped by myth and memory politics. West German elites found in Rommel an emblem around which they could reconstruct a respectable military tradition. Allied commanders sometimes spoke of him with a guarded admiration that, in the politics of the early Cold War, smoothed tensions. The complexity of Rommel's relationship with Nazism, his initial accommodation, his later disillusionment, his military service for a criminal regime, and his resistance of a certain kind, allowed different groups to emphasize elements that fit their purposes. The historian's task, then, is to resist simplifying that prism. Rommel was neither saint nor simple villain. He was a man whose decisions were shaped by a professional ethos and by political constraints that were often lethal. Even the language of betrayal needs unpacking. Betrayal to whom? Betrayal of Hitler as a person? Betrayal of the Führer's ideology? Betrayal of Germany as a state? Rommel's own framing seems to have been nationalistic rather than personal. He had been loyal to the idea of Germany, to its military and its people. And when he concluded that Hitler's policies endangered the nation, his actions shifted accordingly. That shift can be read as treachery from Hitler's perspective, because the Führer conflated personal loyalty with national destiny. It can also be read as an effort to preserve the nation from what Rommel saw as catastrophic leadership. The moral center of this story, the point where judgment is most fraught, is the forced choice Rommel was given in October 1944. That moment reveals much about the regime that killed him and much about the man who accepted his fate. The choice disguised a coercive execution designed to preserve myth and to silence questions. It was not a humane offer. Rommel's acceptance was not merely personal resignation, it was an act shaped by a desire to protect those he loved and to preserve what honor he could. Whether that choice constitutes moral failure or tragic prudence is a debate that will continue insofar as it reflects how we weigh individual agency under coercion. In the final accounting, how should we answer the title question? The most defensible verdict rejects a simple label. Rommel did not betray Hitler in the sense of participating in or endorsing the assassination plot of July 20. Nor did he remain an uncritical servant of the Führer to the end. He occupied a middle ground, a senior military figure who, when confronted with catastrophic strategic error and growing evidence of moral atrocity, shifted his loyalty from the person of the Führer to the wider idea of Germany's survival. To Hitler, such a shift was betrayal. To Rommel and to others, it was an act of reluctant patriotism, an attempt to save a country he loved from ruin. That ambiguity matters because it forces us to confront the way judgment is applied in times of tyranny. Under dictatorial rule, the moral meaning of dissent is often determined by those who hold power. A request to negotiate can be made into treason, and a refusal to kill can be painted as cowardice. Rommel's life and death illustrate how difficult it is for moral clarity to emerge in such conditions. His story is a study in constrained agency. He had options, but none were good. He made choices consistent with his character and his ethos, choices that preserved some moral boundaries while accepting compromises that others cannot excuse. When we recall Rommel today, we must therefore keep several truths in mind. He was a brilliant tactician whose operational mind reshaped desert warfare and whose ideas shaped coastal defenses in 1944. He was a man shaped by a military culture that valorized order, honor, and discipline, and that insulated officers from political realities in dangerous ways. He was not a leading architect or manager of Nazi crimes, but neither was he a vigorous public opponent of them. He counseled moderation and legal remedies at a point when violence and desperation were becoming the instruments of policy. Finally, he died in a manner orchestrated to protect a regime's narrative, a death that fused dignity and coercion into a single official story. Legacy, then, is less about absolutes and more about how societies use memory. Post-war Germany, Allied authorities, and veterans groups all found in Rommel an image they could wield. Later scholarship has tried to reinsert nuance into that image, insisting that admiration for his military craft must be accompanied by a sober appraisal of the limits of his moral and political resistance. That balanced view sees Rommel as neither villain nor saint, but as a figure whose life opens a window into the dilemmas officers faced when obedience to command collided with the unfolding crimes and strategic disasters of their state. In the end, Rommel's alleged betrayal of Hitler recedes as a tidy label and returns as a question about where loyalty is due when a leader leads his nation to ruin. Rommel's answer was to shift his allegiance from personal loyalty to what he believed to be the national interest. Whether that was betrayal or patriotic rescue depends on one's definition of duty. History instructs us to hold both possibilities in view and to recognize that in totalitarian systems, acts perceived as moderate can carry consequences equal to the grandest rebellions. The question the title posed, Rommel's betrayal of Hitler, what really happened, cannot be answered with a single, sharp verdict. The historical record shows a man who refused assassination, who counseled negotiation, who tried to protect his family, and who died under coercive terms arranged by a regime terrified of dissent. For Hitler, Rommel's counsel was treasonous. For Rommel, counsel was a desperate appeal for the preservation of Germany. The truth is therefore layered. Rommel did not conspire to murder Hitler. He did oppose Hitler's policies, and his opposition, moderate, complicated, at times ambiguous, was treated as betrayal by a dictator who permitted no challenge. If there is a lesson beyond the particulars of one man's life, it is this: moral action in a dictatorship often wears the face of contradiction. Courage may look like moderation, and moderation may be punished as treason. Rommel's life and death force us to ask uncomfortable questions about responsibility, complicity, and the cost of dissent when institutions are designed to crush disagreement. Manfred Rommel's recollections, offered later as family testimony, capture that human cost. He remembered a father who sought to balance duty with decency, who felt the weight of command and the burden of conscience, and who paid the ultimate price for the stance he took. That memory is not a verdict. It is a testimony to the complexities of human choice at a time when clear moral paths were scarce. If this exploration has deepened your sense of how complicated history can be, tell us what you think in the comments. Was Rommel a traitor, a reluctant patriot, or something in between? For more on the strategic and intelligence strands that shaped June 1944, including a closer look at Operation Fortitude and how Allied deception worked, check the linked videos next.